Hi everybody. In this episode of Fun with Maps, we're going to talk about the world's largest island, Greenland, okay? I'm your host, Dan Hansen. I always thought it was cool that Greenland, which is 80% covered with ice, is named green, and Iceland, its neighbor here, which is green, is called Iceland. And there's stories about that, various different ones. You know, we probably in school you might have heard the legend that Eric the Red, great name, named him that way to attract settlers to Greenland and dissuade them from coming to Iceland. So basically what happened when the Vikings would discover a new territory, they would take the first thing that they saw or was noticeable and put land at the end of it. So like when Leif Erikson, who is Eric the Red's son, saw the Canadian coast when he landed there, he saw these grapevines there, and also they called it Vineland or Vinland. So that's how they would name things. But then with Iceland, there was a Norse explorer. He was the first to reach the island from Europe, and all he saw was snow when he was there, so he first named it Snaeland, or which becomes Snowland. So later a Viking colonizer came, and he was a little bit more egotistic. So he would, when he'd get to a land, he'd name it after himself. So he called it Gardar's Island or Garor's Island, something like that. So the next colonizer, though, changed all that. His name was Fioki Vilgersarson or something. He was bummed out because Fioki, he left Europe, gets to Iceland. On the way, his daughter fell overboard and was killed. And when he arrived in Iceland, all his livestock that he had brought with him died. So he was all depressed. He went up in a high area there and looked out, and all he saw was some fjords and ice. So he just, some icebergs. He was really bummed out about the whole situation, so he named it Iceland, and it's stuck to that to this day. So, but despite Fioki's his attempt to, his depression and his attempt to dissuade future colonization, when the sailors got back to Norway, they spread the word, hey, Iceland, this is a place, you know, it's fertile and it's rich, and it's just waiting for people to settle, and actually a mass migration to Iceland began after that. So then we get to Greenland, which is the subject of this episode of Fun with Maps, and it was discovered 982 AD, okay, by Eric the Red, father of Leif Erikson, as I said. Discovered, I say, by, you know, Europeans. There were Inuits there before. But he landed on the southeast part of the island, and what's interesting is with the naming conventions, when they look at like mollusk fossils and stratification of the ice and all that, the temperature back then in 982 was significantly higher in Greenland. So right now it's frigid and ice covered, but back then maybe it was, with the temperature being significantly higher, maybe it wasn't quite as icy as it is today. So the reason Eric went to Greenland from Iceland, he had killed 3 people in a feud in Iceland, and Icelandic law said, okay, we either put you to death or you go out in exile. So he chose exile. He went out in his ships and just became an adventurer on the open seas for the rest of his life. And of course, though, like I say, Inuit natives were there first. They called it in their language the land of the people, and a lot of them still do that. We'll see in the map how close it is for people to travel from like Alaska through Canada and the Greenland. So here's a kicker to the whole naming story. Some predicted if trends of, you know, the weather's changed throughout our history, got colder, got warmer, all that. Some are predicting that if current weather trends continue like they are, in about 200 years, Greenland could experience a rise in the thermometer, and Iceland would experience a drop. So in a couple hundred years, you could have Greenland actually being green and Iceland being ice, as first named by the Vikings. So it's a fascinating country. Let's take a look at the map of Greenland. Okay, here's a CIA map of the Arctic region. Here's the Arctic Ocean. Right here in the center is the North Pole. Okay, here's Russia. Here's Europe, Russia coming around. The Bering Sea, North Pacific. Here's Alaska in the United States. Here's northern Canada. And here's today's subject, Greenland. And there's Iceland there. So Greenland is actually a collection of islands between the Arctic Ocean up here and the North Atlantic down here. But it's really one large island with hundreds of other smaller islands, and they come and go, as we'll see. And this is the Canadian archipelago here. Archipelagos are just a collection of islands in a sea. So here's another CIA map. This is North America. So you see Russia up here. We talked how close that is to Alaska here, Canada, US, Mexico, all that. And here's Greenland. And speaking of close, at its closest point here, Greenland is just 10 miles away from Canada. And this is Ellesmere Island up here, Ellesmere Island. They actually share this water channel, the nearest strait, and at the narrowest point it's only 10 miles. And you can tell that at some point in history these were probably connected. Greenland was connected here, and the natives just walked across. That's the shortest distance though between Greenland and Canada, just those 10 miles. So now if you watch Jeopardy or other quiz shows like that, you'll see questions. I've seen several about what continent Greenland is on, and people always answer Europe, and the answer is it's part of the continent of North America, and you can see that really clearly here in this map. But it's been politically and culturally associated with Europe, specifically Norway and Denmark, the colonial powers, for over a millennium, beginning in 986. So Greenland is still part of the Kingdom of Denmark. The Kingdom of Denmark has three constituent countries: Denmark, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. So all those people in those three are citizens of Denmark and the European Union. So this is 10 miles. Here's Iceland here. The closest between Iceland and Greenland, where the Greenland Straits are the narrowest, is about 190 miles. So this is 10 miles here, this is 190 miles here. So here we zoom in on the map of Greenland, and you can see, okay, the Arctic Ocean here, and all these lines are going up to the North Pole. Here's what we just talked about, Ellesmere Island. Here's Hans Island, which they kind of argue over who owns it. But this is just 10 miles here. That's really, really impressive. The majority of the residents are Inuit. Their ancestors migrated probably from Alaska through northern Canada and gradually settling across the island by the 13th century. And with it being so close, they probably didn't even have to cross the sea there, the strait there. It was connected back then and they could walk. Today the population is concentrated mainly on the southwest coast down here, and the rest of the population, it's very sparsely populated up here. That's because 3/4, 75 to 80% of Greenland is covered by the only permanent ice sheet outside of Antarctica. So in 2020 they had just over 56,000 people, and they've got this huge area. So Greenland is the least densely populated region in the world. So like I say, about 80% is covered by this continental glacier. It's the world's second largest ice mass. At its maximum, the ice is about 1.9 miles thick, and it's thickest in the center here, and it flows out to the sea. So they're thinking, as we have changes in the climate and all, if a lot of the glacial cover melts, it'll probably unearth some minor islands around the coast. They'll be revealed. So I said that Greenland is the world's largest island. So here's Greenland up here. But what about Australia? Isn't Australia bigger? Well, yeah, it is. In terms of land area, Greenland's about 836,000 square miles. Australia is much larger. It's almost 3 million square miles. So it's about 3.5 times the size of Greenland. But Australia is usually classified as a continent, not an island. So that's why, Australia is bigger, and it's certainly surrounded by water. So it's an island in that respect. But Greenland is considered the largest island because it's not a continent. It's, in fact, people have said Greenland is an enormous island surrounded by other enormous islands. So on the west, as we'll see, here's the Canadian archipelago. It's got Baffin Island, which is the 5th largest in the world. Ellesmere Island, it's 10th largest by the Baffin Bay there. On the east, it's separated by to Iceland here, which is 18th largest. And then we've got Spitsbergen, the 36th largest, and even Newfoundland, the 16th largest island in the world, is to the southwest. So Greenland, enormous islands surrounded by other enormous islands, which begs, if this is number one, let's do the top 10 real quick. So after Greenland, we have New Guinea at number 2 over here. Then we've got Borneo here in Southeast Asia, and that, remember from the Fun with Maps episode on Indonesia, it's got shared by Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, so they're number 3. Remember our Fun with Maps episode on Madagascar? Here's Madagascar over here in the Indian Ocean. They're number 4. Baffin Island is located in northern Canada. It's part of the Canadian territory of Nunavut, and it's about 507,000 square miles. So it's the largest island in Canada right there, and 5th largest in the world. Sumatra over here in western Indonesia is number 6. Honshu, Japan, it's the largest and most populous island of Japan. In fact, the name Honshu directly translates to main island in English, so it's the 7th largest. Victoria Island's another northern Canadian island. It's split between Nunavut and the Northwest Territories. Victoria Island is bigger than 36 of the 50 United States, but it's so big, but just under 2,000 people live there. In fact, they say there's more caribou and muskox on the island than there are people. So Victoria Island's number 8. As we saw recently in a Fun with Maps episode, here's Great Britain, their number 9 largest island. And that brings us to number 10, which we just spoke about, Ellesmere Island, up here, which is just 10 miles away from Greenland. Victoria Island, it lies entirely in the Arctic Circle. Just 146 people live on the island, so, and it's mostly a mountain range, so it's really sparsely populated, but pretty large. So Greenland is divided into 5 municipalities, none of which I can pronounce well. So here they are. You can see them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and about 1/3 of the population live in Nuuk, the capital and largest city. So Nuuk is it here, okay? And of course it's on the coast, on the west coast, and all of these, all the population is going to be on the coast. Second largest city is Sisimiut up here, a couple hundred miles north of Nuuk, and luckily they have ferries. The Arctic Umiak Line ferry connects all these cities on the western part of Greenland here, and that's how they get around, because you really can't travel up here much. A Fun with Maps fact here: Greenland contains the world's largest and northernmost national park, and here it is, the Northeast Greenland National Park. It was established in 1974 and expanded to its present size in 1988, and it's about it protects 375,000 square miles of the interior and northeast coast of Greenland. So all this area is the national park, and just this park is bigger than all but 29 countries in the world. So that's pretty interesting. And then up here, as we'll see, there's a something called Thule Air Base, which the U.S. Space Force actually, we'll get into when we talk about World War II here. This is a good map by someone named Uwe Detering, and it's an extension of the part of Greenland occupied by Norway, 1931 to 33. They call it the map of Erik Raudis Land, which to us, of course, is Eric the Red. So So again, you can see here's Thule that I just talked about, where the air base is. Here you can see how close Canada and Greenland are, and here's Iceland, and you know, it's, you can see the coastline is certainly not smooth. It's all inlets and bays, and there's Nuuk, the capital, right there. So Greenland's been inhabited over at least the last 4,500 years at intervals by Arctic peoples. They probably migrated from Canada here. Like I say, it sure looks like this was connected at some point, and they may have just walked across. Norsemen settled the uninhabited southern part of Greenland beginning in the 10th century. So those who walked across from Canada probably settled up here. The Norsemen who came by ship settled down here after settling Iceland. So here the Norsemen came, they ran into Iceland, and then they kept going west and they ran into Greenland, and they settled this land down here. And of course we all know that Leif Erikson became the first known European to reach North America in here nearly 500 years before Columbus reached the Caribbean. So the name of the country in the indigenous Greenlandic language is Kalalit Nunat, which just stands for Land of the Kalalit, and the Kalalit are the indigenous Greenlandic Inuit who inhabited the country's western region. Okay, and the Inuit arrived probably in the 13th century. They had a lot of influence from Norway and Norwegians, but it wasn't formally under the Norwegian crown until 1261. But then Norway lost its a lot of power during the Black Death in the late 15th century, and they entered a severe decline. So then the Portuguese stepped in, and they claimed the island for a while, and they named it Terra do Lavrador while they had it, which later they changed that and they applied that name to Labrador in Canada. So this is an interesting map from 1747, an English map, and you can see here's Greenland, and it says like old Greenland or Groenland. Here it says ridges of mountains covered with perpetual ice and snow, and over here it says the coast is dangerous of access because of floating and fixed mountains of ice. So again, though, you can see all these nooks and crannies, these inlets and all, not a smooth coastline, as we've said. And this is how, and here's Iceland right there. This is how it looked to the settlers in 1747. So in the early 17th century, Danish explorers reached Greenland again, and Greenland actually became Danish in 1814, was fully integrated in the Danish state in 1953 under the Constitution of Denmark. And with that, the people in Greenland became citizens of Denmark. But of course, Inuit and other indigenous people had inhabited Alaska for thousands of years before the Tsarist government of Russia, which owned it, established a presence there around the mid-18th century. Now this is a great story. So Russia first approached the U.S. about selling the territory, which we know as Alaska, when President James Buchanan was president. But negotiations broke off and were stalled by the outbreak of the Civil War in the United States. So this is a picture of the globe from 2005, and courtesy of NASA. And what happened then, here we'll see, okay, Greenland, here's the United States, Mexico, South America, Canada, here's Alaska, there's Russia, here's Greenland, here's the Arctic, okay, here's Iceland, okay. So what happened, Russia wanted to sell Alaska, and U.S. Secretary of State William H. Seward signed a treaty with them, said, okay, we'll purchase Alaska for $7 million, which back then was a crazy amount of money. But it was, I mean, obviously it was a bargain price. It was roughly 2 cents an acre. And Congress at the time and the press ridiculed the purchase. They called it Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, President Andrew Johnson's Polar Bear Garden, and all that. You know, In 1867, then 2 years later, Seward worked to explore the possibility of buying Greenland and perhaps Iceland too. But Congress, was still reeling from what they called Seward's folly, and they ended that project. But can you imagine if Russia still owned Alaska, had this huge piece of land with gold and resources and all that, connected to Canada and the United States here, and or if the United States had been able to purchase Greenland and or Iceland here? I mean, history would really be different. So, following World War II, the U.S. developed a geopolitical interest in Greenland, and in 1946 made an offer to Denmark for $100 million to buy Greenland, but Denmark refused to sell it. And then, there's still an interest there in the resource base of Greenland, and they've got hydrocarbons off the Greenlandic coast and all that. And in August 2019, you may remember, there was some talk about the U.S. proposing to buy Greenland again, and the famous statement from Premier Kim Kielsen of Greenland, who said, quote, "Greenland is not for sale and it cannot be sold, but Greenland is open for trade and cooperation with other countries, including the United States," unquote. So, Greenland's connection to Denmark was severed in April 1940, early in World War II, when Denmark was occupied by the Nazis. So that's when the U.S. stepped into and occupied Greenland to defend it against a possible invasion by Germany. Can you imagine if the German forces had this launching pad here against the United States, or even Britain over to the east in World War II? And the U.S. occupied Greenland until 1945. And here's a fun with maps fact. So the Danish Sirius Patrol guarded the northeastern shores of Greenland in 1942 by using dog sleds. That's the only way they could really get around, the dog sleds. And they did detect several German weather stations and other installations. They told U.S. troops, who came in and destroyed the facilities. And Albert Speer, who was a close ally of Hitler, after the collapse of the Third Reich, it was rumored that he was considering escaping to Greenland, but eventually he decided to surrender to the U.S. Armed Forces. This is an aerial picture of the Thule Air Base that we talked about in the northwest of Greenland. So now it's 1950, and Denmark says, okay, U.S., you can regain the use of Thule Air Base. Has greatly expanded in 51-53 as part of a unified NATO Cold War defense strategy. No pun intended with the Cold War. Fun with maps fact, the military of the United States used Bluie, B-L-U-I-E, as code name for Greenland in World War II. So they had several bases. They call them like Bluie East and then a number like Bluie East 3 or Bluie West 2 or something like that. So that was the code word for Greenland in World War II. This is a great map, another CIA fact book map. So here we've got Russia, just massive, right? And here's Europe, okay, and it's the Arctic Ocean, and this center point here, that's the North Pole. Here's Alaska. Here's Canada, here's the archipelagos, here's those islands we were talking about. Here's Victoria Island and Baffin Island and Ellesmere Island, those three big ones. Here, of course, is Iceland, and then here is Greenland. And again, we see how close Greenland and Canada are there. So this is a great map. So now it's 1953, and the Danish were basically wanted to kind of assimilate Greenland. They were dissuading, let's put it that way, people from the Greenland ways and wanted them to be more Danish. So they even secondary schools, kids had to go to school in Denmark for their post-secondary education, and they wanted exclusive use of the Danish language and all that. So the cultural ties to Greenland were being cut, but that just led to a native Greenlanders had a movement for independence and for Greenlandic history, and when the Danes entered the European Common Market in 1972, Denmark began to seek a different status for Greenland, and that resulted in the Home Rule Act of 1979. So here's the flag of Greenland, and it's got the two horizontal stripes, and then that disc to the left to center there. The design represents the sun reflecting off a field of ice, but you'll notice the colors are the same as that of the Danish flag, and that just reinforces Greenland's link to the Kingdom of Denmark. But in 1979, Denmark granted home rule to Greenland, and in 2008, Greenlanders voted in favor of the Self-Government Act. So it took more power from the Danish government to the local Greenlandic government, and local stuff basically was taken care of by Greenland, and international stuff like citizenship, monetary policy, foreign affairs, including defense, that was still part of Denmark. This is a great picture of Greenland from space, and you can really see the ice cover. Here's Greenland covered in ice. Here's Iceland covered in green. So it's pretty ironic or comical or whatever. And then you've got Ellesmere here up here, and the Canadian islands. But from space here, you can see just these coastal areas where it's not covered in ice, and that's where the people live. And here in Iceland, it's green. So in 2022, the Greenlandic people were almost 90% of Greenland. Then the rest were Danish and other Nords and a few others. The official language, no longer Danish. It's Greenlandic or Kalaallisut. They also speak Danish and English. And in 2009, Greenlanders were recognized as a separate people under international law. Greenlandic was declared the sole official language in this historic ceremony there. This is a really good picture of the Nuussuaq district in Nuuk, which is the capital of Greenland, as we said, and that's a Sermitsiaq mountain in the back. So sparsely populated, really colorful buildings, so it looks cool. And then this huge mountain in the back. I think the highest peak in Greenland is only about 12,000 feet, but this is in the capital of Greenland in Nuuk. So the elephant in the room is climate change and global warming or global freezing or whatever. This is an ice sheet thickness map created by Eric Gaba and Wikimedia Commons user Sting, and it's a map of Greenland's ice sheet thickness. So you can't really tell the distinction in the colors here too much, but this is in here. It's 3,205 meters, and it drops down this 3,000 and 2,500 and 2,000, 1,500. So obviously in the center it's a lot thicker, and as you go to the coast, it's down to maybe 10 meters here or something, ice thickness. So here's a fun with maps fact. The lowest temperature ever recorded in the northern hemisphere, not Greenland, not Canada, not just North America, in the northern hemisphere, was recorded in Greenland near the topographic summit of the Greenland ice sheet on December 22nd, 1991, and the temperature reached minus 93.3 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, this map shows all those not smooth coastline, how close Ellesmere Island and Canada are here in the Denmark Strait, how close Iceland is, Greenland Sea, the Baffin Bay, Labrador Sea, North Atlantic, Arctic Oceans there. Now, well, here's what's interesting. You have all this ice, and it's mostly in the middle and then pans out. So ice has weight. So the ice sheet has depressed the central land area, so it's kind of a basin, almost like a bowl, and it's like 980 feet below sea level, and it's much higher at the rims of the bowl as you go out near the coast. And that makes sense. You've got all this weight from ice there, just pushed the land down. So this is a topographic map of Greenland by a user called Skew T. And so if you take the ice sheet off, this is what it looks like. Okay, so that's the topography of Greenland with the ice sheet taken off. And of course, all the towns and settlements, the population are here in the areas, on the coasts where there's no ice. Here's a Fun with Maps fact. In 2007, the existence of a new island was announced, and it's called, in English, Warming Island. It's always been there, but it was covered by a glacier. So the glacier in 2002 was shrinking, and by 2007 it melted away. So now you've got this new island here, and Oxford Atlas of the World named it Place of the Year in 2007. As we wrap up, here's the coat of arms of Greenland. It's pretty cool, the polar bear, and it's here's a Fun with Maps fact to wrap things up. Greenland's the only country in the Americas where natives make up a majority of the population. It's just, as you can tell, it's just a very unique and different and a cool place. So I still like the legend that Derek tried to fool people and go to Greenland, it's beautiful, and go stay away from Iceland, it's icy, but I'm not sure if that's true or not, but there's good stories behind that. If they haven't already, someone should write an alternative history, a story or book or something, where Russia did not sell Alaska to the U.S. or the U.S. bought Greenland and Iceland. I think it'd make a really cool story. I'd read that. So before we wrap up this episode of Fun with Maps, people are always asking, when are you going to do a map of XYZ, say? And we have a long list. The world is full of interesting places. It doesn't have to be a country or an island or anything. It could be a city or just a region or whatever. So we have a long list we're working on. But if there's something interesting to you that you want us to cover sometime, send us a comment, post a comment here in the section. We'll read them, and maybe we can get to it. So thanks for that, and thanks also for watching this episode of Fun with Maps. As always, if you like it, please subscribe, tell your friends. I'm your host, Dan Hansen. Until next time, keep on having fun with maps.